My name is Sarah Thompson, and it is good to be with you over technology if I cannot be there in person. I'm the Executive Director of Christian Peacemaker Teams, which is an organization that is an experiment in answering some gutsy questions. Those questions are, what if we, as people who believe in peace and justice and nonviolent conflict resolution, what if we trained as hard for that as our militaries train for war? And what would happen if we were willing to give of our lives for this cause in a similar way that soldiers are expected to give of their lives for the cause of war? What could happen? And what would happen if we collectively put as many resources towards creative and nonviolent experiments as we put towards violent and destructive ones? What could happen? So Christian Peacemaker Teams is an experiment in that we are Christian identified and have multi-faith membership. And we work at the invitation of local partners to provide international leverage to the grassroots movements to resist violent oppression. So if you are ever in Chicago, where the CPT headquarters is, or if you are ever in Palestine or northern Iraq or Colombia or in Canada, that's currently where we have programming. We're working alongside First Nations here on Turtle Island, and also a lot of our programming supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples worldwide, as well as our commitment to nonviolent social change. So it is good to be participating in this panel of scholar activism, because one thing that's really important to the work that Christian Peacemaker Teams does is something called the action and reflection cycle. We learn a lot by the actions we do, and there's so many actions going on. It can be difficult to take time to reflect on what's happening. But without deep reflection over time, CPT for sure would have disappeared. It's the depth of reflection that we can do together, which may be called something like scholarship, that has helped us to continue to grow and learn and change as an organization that can best serve the global movement for decolonization, for justice for all people, for liberation of the land, and the glory of God. So, in the work of reflection together, we've learned ways that, for example, violence was not only in the external problems we were facing. Rather, violence and nonviolence cuts through the heart of each one of us, as Thich Nhat Hanh says. And so we began, for example, as an organization to look at the ways in which structural racism, sexism, heterosexism, and Christian hegemony were inside of the peacemakers as they went and walked kids to and from school in Palestine, as we worked alongside Iraqi civilians in the midst of war. That violence that we so badly want to see diminished in the world also has a lot to do with what we want to see diminished in ourselves. And the process of reflection and training is all about looking at the scholarship that can help us to change our thinking patterns around those things and to ask forgiveness for ways in which that we have continued violence, even in our peace and justice making work. So, for example, to start with the biblical text, I believe that Christianity is a social movement. It's an old and long one, and it's related to other social movements that are sometimes called religions around it. But we think about um, the social movement of God in the world, however you choose to conceptualize that, and people's response to what it is that they consider ultimate. That's a process in many ways of actively engaging your world for change. And in some ways, some of the sacred scriptures that we have are documentations and reflections on what's been happening in that process of change. So you could look at the Bible itself in some ways as a documentation of scholar activism, this interaction between action and reflection. And in the interaction between action and reflection, you also have the form that it's in, and most of it is a storied form. Knowing that a lot of those stories were oral before they were written, I think is instructive for us as we continue our scholar activism today. We need to make sure that what we are learning from scholarship can be accountable to movements and accessible to movements, number one. Stories still work, and they stick with us. One of my favorite zines that I've ever seen, a zine usually being a small piece of paper, sets of pieces of paper in black and white with sketches and writing. One of my favorite zines that I've seen broke down a complex piece of literature and made it available to those who were working day in and day out on issues of sexual and domestic violence. And they made it possible, one second, sorry about that. They made the information in this complex text accessible to the people who needed it most and who did not have access due to language and education levels to that particular text itself. So if you're a professor or even someone working with a piece of literature in a church or synagogue or mosque setting, you could invite people in the classroom to make a summary of what they're hearing and add sketches and images and ways to bring the story alive and accessible to many more people. I think that's one way to bridge scholarship and activism. Another example of the action reflection cycle, which I've learned a lot from, is the Poor People's Campaign and Poverty Initiative and Cairo Center. Much of the action that I did in college and afterwards in terms of like liberation theology, Black feminist scholarship and activism really focused on trying to get as many people to every meeting as possible, and we're trying to build a mass movement to make an impact. And that takes a lot of action, and that is a really important approach. But what I've learned from the Poor People's Campaign is starting from the space of reflection. And so Poor People's Campaign is building on the movement that came out of 1967, building an intersectional coalition to challenge the way that economic policy plays out and to challenge economic policy that is oppressive. And it does that across color lines by developing a shared analysis about what is actually going on and what are the powers and principalities that are putting so much pressure on everyday people. And instead of trying to get everyone out to reignite this Poor People's Campaign, building on what happened in 67, they started a long time ago, and they started in small groups of study circles. So these circles got together and are still meeting to read together, to read from the writings of movement leaders around the world, to also read the news together, to read big, significant texts like Das Kapital and other texts about economic systems together. And in this reading together, it's a way to support one another when a concept is difficult to understand. And it's also a way to share examples from your daily life in communication with this text and with your small group that you study it with. And what this builds is it builds a camaraderie, it builds compassion, understanding, it builds the practice of working through conflict, through working together towards molding an analysis that really makes sense, not only to yourself as like an individual scholar maybe, but to a group for whom the actions that will be taken as a result of this reflection work together will have those life or death consequences. So when it comes time to act together in a group, they are stronger and they don't necessarily get broken up as a result of their first action. Sometimes that can happen to activist groups. There's a lot of people fired up and ready to go, and they take an action, and it's so difficult because of the responses of the powers and principalities and the different interpretations that people have and the emotional blowback that happens, that the group cannot necessarily hold together after taking their first or second action. And what we need now, as we see the imprint and power of structures of violence in this world, what we need is resilient individuals and resilient groups that can take action together and already have a basis for being able to reflect together well, so that we can remain compassionate, open-hearted human beings in the face of such difficulty. I just got a call from a dear one out at Standing Rock who's been doing this work for a while and who was providing for many of the first-time activists or young activists out there, providing them with a listening ear as they found themselves burning out and hitting a wall, and realizing that not on all their own effort could these things change, and needing to move into a time of reflection, but feeling afraid that if they left the front line, everything would fall apart. And he was able to say to them that what's really falling apart is the paradigm in which you've been doing activism. And if you take some time to do some reflection and recognize that you're not the first one in the line of people fighting this, and you won't be the last, inshallah, if you do that, not only will you fall apart, but you'll be able to come back reconstituted in a healthier way, in a more grounded way, in a way that you can deeply face the mess that we're in a way that you can recognize that those structures of violence, of racism, of sexism, of heterosexism, of Christian hegemony, that they're not only outside of us, but they're also inside of us as well. And so if you take the time to reflect and to read the scholars on this, that you will be able to find your way forward and find an even deeper vocation and commitment to the work. So I think just the basic use of the action reflection cycle and deepening that out as well can be a really strong bridge that we can make. Just as a last point, one of the deepenings of the action reflection cycle that has been helpful to me is the work of Joanna Macy and the work that reconnects, which has 5 points on a spiral. In that action reflection cycle, recognizing that that we will be stronger if we ground in gratitude, instead of grounding in our fear and anger and grief, which are also real and important. And so we honor those emotions. But first we're grounding in gratitude, then honoring that pain, then seeing with new eyes and going through that paradigm switch, seeing the systemic aspects of so many things and seeing the power of our interconnectedness. Then taking some time to be before we return to doing. But indeed, returning towards that doing with a deeper sense of self, a sense of accompaniment, and a sense of the fact that we can only go as far externally as we go internally, and only go as far internally as we go externally. So our deep interconnectedness with the process of liberation. Thank you. Gotta take that call again.